In 1892, Sherlock Holmes received a telegram from John Scott Eccles, who had a strange experience. Holmes was bored and eager to solve a new problem. Eccles arrived, looking disheveled and upset. He told Holmes that he had visited Garcia at Wisteria Lodge, but something went wrong. Before Eccles could explain, Inspector Gregson and Inspector Baines arrived, revealing that Garcia was murdered, and Eccles was a suspect due to a letter found in Garcia's pocket. Holmes calmed Eccles and encouraged him to continue his story. Eccles explained that he met Garcia through the Melville family, and they became friends. Garcia invited Eccles to Wisteria Lodge, but something sinister occurred. I visited Escher to meet a man named Garcia, who lived with a servant and a cook. His household was unusual, and I felt uneasy when I arrived. During dinner, Garcia received a mysterious note that made him seem even more nervous. Later, I went to bed, but when I woke up, everyone had vanished, including Garcia. I was furious and thought it was a prank. I investigated and found that the rent had been paid, and the Spanish embassy knew nothing about Garcia. I sought help from Sherlock Holmes, who was intrigued by my story. Inspector Gregson and Detective Baines were also involved, and they found a note that had been burned in the fireplace. The note was written by a woman and had cryptic instructions. Holmes analyzed the note and found more details, but its meaning remained unclear. Mr. Scott Eccles visited Mr. Garcia at Wisteria Lodge, but when he woke up, Garcia was gone. Later, Garcia's body was found on Oxshott Common, brutally murdered. Inspector Baines and Gregson investigated and found a letter from Eccles in Garcia's pocket, leading them to Eccles. Eccles retained Sherlock Holmes to solve the case. Holmes collaborated with Baines and discovered that Garcia died between 1 a.m. and the rain that night. Eccles claimed to have heard Garcia's voice in his bedroom at 1 a.m., which seemed impossible. Holmes believed the case was not complex, but had novel features. Baines found remarkable things at the house, which he wanted Holmes to see. Holmes thought the crime was linked to the disappearance of Garcia's servants and Eccles' strange experience. He suspected that Garcia's servants were involved in the murder and fled. Holmes also believed that Eccles was brought to Wisteria Lodge to provide an alibi for someone. The mysterious note with the phrase, "our own colors," green and white, seemed like a signal, possibly related to a jealous husband. Here's a summary of the text in 1,000 characters. Holmes and Watson investigate a mysterious case involving a cryptic message. They receive a telegram with a list of names and addresses, including Lord Harringby, Sir George F. Folliot, and others. They visit Wisteria Lodge, where they meet Inspector Baines and find a constable, Walters, who's shaken by a strange encounter. Walters describes a giant figure with a queer face peering through the window. Holmes examines the scene and finds a large footprint. They search the house, finding little evidence except for some clothing and a mysterious, withered figure in the kitchen. Holmes is intrigued by the case, which involves a torn-apart white cock and a sinister relic. Baines and Inspector showed Holmes a zinc pail of blood and a platter of charred bone pieces. A doctor confirmed they weren't human. Holmes was impressed with Baines' handling of the case. Baines had a theory, but wanted to solve it on his own. Holmes let him, saying he'd follow his own path. Holmes seemed to be on a hot scent, but he didn't share his thoughts with Watson. Days passed, and Holmes spent his time walking, chatting with villagers, and visiting the British Museum. Inspector Baines made an arrest, catching a huge, hideous mulatto who had revisited the crime scene. Holmes was skeptical, warning Baines not to commit himself too far unless he was sure. Baines was confident in his own system. Holmes and Watson went to see Baines, who described the arrested man as a savage who hardly spoke English. Holmes shrugged, feeling Baines was riding for a fall. He wanted Watson's help that night, putting him in touch with the situation. Here's the summary. Sherlock Holmes is investigating a case involving Garcia's death. A note was handed to Garcia on the evening of his death, which suggests a criminal enterprise. Holmes believes Garcia arranged for Scott Eccles to be present as an alibi. Garcia's servants disappeared, likely because they were Confederates in the crime. Holmes thinks the person who took Garcia's life is the one against whom the criminal enterprise was directed. Holmes focuses on High Gable, a large house near the scene of the tragedy, where Mr. Henderson, a curious and masterful man, lives with his secretary, Mr. Lucas, and 2 children. The governess, Miss Burnett, is also part of the household. Holmes learns that Henderson is rich and has a dark past, and the servants are afraid of him. A letter was sent to Garcia from within the household, likely written by Miss Burnett. If she wrote the note, she might be bitter and want revenge against those who killed Garcia. However, Miss Burnett has vanished since the night of the murder, and Holmes needs to determine if she's alive, a prisoner, or dead. Holmes and Watson investigated a mysterious case involving a woman's disappearance from an extraordinary household. They couldn't get a warrant, so they decided to take matters into their own hands. Holmes suggested they sneak into the woman's room at night to uncover the truth. Before they could act, Warner, their agent, brought the woman to them, having rescued her from her captors at the train station. The woman, Miss Burnett, was drugged with opium, but soon recovered. Inspector Baines arrived, and they pieced together the evidence, revealing that the mastermind behind the disappearance was Don Murillo, Aka the Tiger of San Pedro, a notorious tyrant who had escaped justice years ago. Miss Burnett, whose real name was Signora Victor Durando, had a personal vendetta against Murillo, who had murdered her husband, a San Pedro minister, and ruined many lives. She joined a secret society dedicated to bringing Murillo to justice. In the transformed Henderson, I attached myself to the household of the fallen despot Murillo, keeping others informed of his movements. As the governess, I smiled on him, did my duty to his children, and waited for the right moment. An attempt to avenge Garcia's father, a former dignitary in San Pedro, failed in Paris. We zigzagged across Europe, eventually returning to England, where Murillo took a house. Garcia, with 2 trusty companions, waited for revenge. At night, Murillo slept alone, and Garcia could find him. However, everything went wrong. I excited Lopez's suspicion, and he caught me sending a note to Garcia. They dragged me to my room, judged me a traitress, and forced me to reveal Garcia's address. They murdered Garcia, and I was confined to my room, terrorized and ill-treated for 5 days. I was drugged and taken to a train, but I escaped with the help of a good man. Now, I'm beyond their power. Holmes remarked that our difficulties weren't over, and our legal work began. Baines believed the law would justify them, but the Tiger of San Pedro and his companion evaded capture, committing more crimes. 6 months later, they murdered the Marquis of Montalva and his secretary in Madrid. Justice finally came when Inspector Baines identified the dark face of the secretary and the masterful features of Murillo. Holmes considered the case chaotic, covering 2 continents and involving 2 groups of mysterious persons. Amid the complexities, they kept a close hold on the essentials and guided along the crooked path. The mulatto cook's return was due to his fetish, and the torn bird, pale of blood, and charred bones were part of a voodoo ritual. Holmes and Watson discussed a brutal ritual where a white cock was plucked alive, or a black goat was killed and burned. Holmes noted that their savage friend followed traditional rituals, but warned Watson that the line between grotesque and horrible is thin.